I'll be celebrating my 8th anniversary in this upcoming April. And, my wife is also a lawyer. And we sat down and we wanted to figure out, like, how can we, number one, obviously avoid the possibility of a messy divorce in the future. But I am a big believer that setting up your finances in a correct way can decrease the chances that you'll get divorced in the first place. And I know a lot of people here, a prenup can actually help my marriage itself. Yes, hang with me here. And so what we said is, one, we're going to have continuing obligations to be transparent about our finances throughout the marriage. So we literally wrote into our prenup this annual meeting that we're going to sit down, we'll disclose all of our finances with each other. That's number one.
Welcome, everybody, back to another exciting show of the About That Water podcast, where we help you build strong financial habits. And today I have the awesome opportunity to interview a guy who's been a divorce attorney for many years, and to the point where he's been married now for 13 years. But can you think about what he's actually going to talk about today? We're talking about prenups. And this is something that a lot of people are afraid to talk about. So welcome to the show, Aaron Thomas. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. So when it comes to prenups and everything like that, what are the dangers of not having a prenup?
Well, I like to say that everybody actually has a prenup. I mean, if we back up and start with, what is a prenup to begin with? A prenup is really just a set of rules that defines your rights and responsibilities to each other, both during and after the marriage. We think about it mainly being financial, but it can go outside of finances too. But and if that is how we define a prenup, the rules that pertain to your finances during and after your marriage, the truth is everybody's got a prenup. You either have one that you have drafted yourself and chosen the rules, or by getting married, you are accepting the rules of the state that you happen to live in. And so the big danger of not having a prenup when you get married is, most people haven't read the default prenup that their state puts in place, and you're subject to those rules, whether you like it or not. And unfortunately, most people don't figure out what those rules are until they are sitting in the office of a divorce lawyer.
And that's kind of a shame, because you think, oh yeah, we're going to live together forever, and everybody don't know what they want to do until they get into that situation, just like let life happen. And how do you even bring up that conversation of a prenup when you just got engaged?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a prenup conversation should be part of a much larger conversation about your finances that hopefully is happening long before you ever get married. When I try to advise people on how to have the conversation about a prenup, I tell people that, one of the worst ideas you can do is start with the word prenup, right? I mean, let's be honest here. I mean, I write prenups for a living, mm-hmm. But even I can admit that the word comes with a certain amount of stigma, and people have preconceived notions about what a prenup is, what it means for your relationship, whether it means that you trust your spouse or your fiance or not. And so it's probably not the best idea to just walk up to your partner and say, "Hey, babe, I want a prenup." Right. The conversation has to start way, way before that. Probably the first place to start, I think, is getting, all of your finances out on the table with your fiance. And honestly, this should happen during the dating process. You shouldn't have to wait till you're married before kind of what your spouse's or your partner's assets look like, what their debts look like. And maybe more importantly than those two things is, what are your financial habits? Are you the kind of person that carries debt on your credit cards, or do you pay them off, every month, or do you not have credit cards at all? Are you saving for retirement? What's your investment strategy? Are you an S&P 500 index fund type of person, or are you have everything in crypto? And so there's a million conversations that should happen before you get to, the place of even discussing, a prenup. You got to, kind of get your financial lives out on the table and disclose them to your partner first.
Yeah, because that's one of the things that my wife and I has always been, even before we decided to get engaged. Like after we got engaged, we started talking about the prenup process. However, life happened. We did a whole episode on this already, which is like her dad had passed away just shortly 2 months after we got married. So we didn't have like a joyous wedding, I guess you would say, like most people do. It's just like we have a lot of family issues to deal with immediately after we got married. Even before we even got tied a knot. That's one of the reasons why we had to move our wedding up is because of the family situation. So being financially naked, I actually did an episode on that in my very first season about that. And getting financially naked, I think it's one of the best things to kind of help us to figure out who's the spender, who's the saver in a relationship. While we were getting serious, before we even started to have that conversation of getting married. So I know we didn't go through that typical process of going through like what they call it, the premarital counseling and so forth and stuff like that. What kind of tips? I know you said just kind of put the money out there and talk about it that way and talk about your habits. Are there preset questions that you already have that will be great starter questions to kind of get people to start talking about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously people can, if people really want to dive in, they can, go to my website. We got a free ebook. I've written an entire book, about kind of, how to go through the prenup process. But so, one step certainly is getting financially naked. I like to say that people have an easier time getting physically naked than they have getting fiscally naked with each other these days. But the conversation, definitely goes further beyond that. I mean, I think that couples have to talk about how do they want to set up their bank accounts when they get married. A lot of people assume that they should follow the path of what their parents or their grandparents did, where there was one bank account and everybody put all of their money in one bank account and all the bills were paid out of that one bank account. But that doesn't really work best for most modern couples because the world has changed since our parents got married. I'll give you an example. My parents got married in, the 1960s. And back then, it was very common for there to just be one bank account between the spouses when they got married. People got married in their early 20s. Their finances were very simple. Retirement accounts were nil. Student loans, people worked their way through school, something you can't really do today. Credit cards were a new thing, so they weren't that common either. And so putting everything in one bank account and paying all your bills from that seemed to make sense. Couples today get married in their 30s or later often. And people come into their marriages with 3 or 4 bank accounts each, 2 or 3 credit cards, car loans, maybe some equity in a house, maybe a small business. And their finances are just a lot more complex when they get married, even if they're not super wealthy, such that taking everything you've got and combining it in one pot is more often going to lead to, misunderstandings or worse, arguments. Or disaster. And so couples have to be very careful about how do they combine their finances and to what extent do they combine their finances. And so I think that couples should, keep some things separate, have their own spending money, have a bank account that's in your own name, have a credit card that's in your own name, and decide how are we going to pay the things that are truly joint and what expenses do we consider truly joint expenses? For most people, that's going to be your mortgage, your rent, your utilities, your groceries, things that you are literally consuming together. But there are going to be things that, that are separate. The meals that you eat out with your buddies instead of your spouse, maybe you want to think about whether those should be coming out of a joint bank account. And is that going to create, an argument? Or is it easier to portion off at least some of your income to have your own spending money so that you can do things, without your spouse, without having to kind of get permission or without angering your spouse? Because like you said, one of you has different spending habits. One of you is a spender. The other one's a saver. So yeah, those are all part of the conversations that need to happen. Yeah, I mean, there are lists of conversations in the book and some of the materials on my website, but certainly spending habits, saving habits, investment habits, what you're coming in with, your family's relationship with money. Are you somebody who's going to inherit $1 million down the line, or are you the kind of person who you're actually supporting your family or supporting aging parents financially? Yeah, all of those things come into play. The reason that I say start with disclosing all of your assets, put it down, and not just discussing it but putting it down on paper, is because when you see what your spouse has on paper, that is naturally going to spawn some of these conversations. Oh, you owe the IRS 20 grand. How did that happen? No judgment, but just, how did that happen? You've got this in credit card debt. How did that happen? Wow, you've saved a ton of money in retirement. When did you start saving? What does that look like? Why is that important to you? And then kind of follow that conversation where it goes.
Yeah, because I think marriage is one of the things that we overlook when it comes to the business side of marriage. And that's one of the things I always think of marriage as a business. So can you, because I know you mentioned it a couple times, can you actually explain that a little bit more about combining the business side of marriage versus just a lovey-dovey, like, hey, I love you, you love me. Okay, we happy now. But when the stuff hits the fan, this is business.
Yeah. I mean, great question. I mean, there are so many parallels between like a marital partnership and a business partnership. They are partnerships, and marriage, as much as we like to think about marriage as just being this relationship based on romance, if you really look at history, marriage has always been, kind of a financial partnership. I mean, you go back to think about, the tradition of a father walking his daughter down the aisle for a wedding. And in our minds, we think of it as this really romantic, moment. It's traditional. A lot of people don't really know where it comes from. But the truth is, what that signifies is the transfer of financial responsibility from father of the household to the husband of a household, because that was the history of it. Now that doesn't match our reality today. Now, today it doesn't necessarily mean that tradition comes from the transference of financial responsibility from father to man of a household. And there's always been financial elements related to marriage. I mean, there's a reason that you go to a courthouse and not just to a priest to get your marriage, consecrated. It's because it is a legal and financial relationship. And so, the way that I look at it is this: if you were to enter into a business partnership with somebody else, would you ever say, we'll just figure out who owns what percentage of the business if this business breaks up down the line? No, of course no one would do that. You're going to get someone, you're going to put something down on paper and say, if anything happens to this business, obviously we want this business to be successful. But if anything happens, here's how much you own, and while we're running the business, these are your responsibilities. These are my responsibilities. And if we're going to do that for a business, shouldn't we do that for our marriages as well, which is probably way more important than any business, endeavor that we get into? We should talk about, what are your expectations? What are our rights and responsibilities? What are my financial obligations to the relationship? What are yours? How are we going to pay for our expenses? And yes, if something happens down the road, I mean, can we agree what belongs to you, what belongs to me, and what belongs to each other? Won't that help us during the marriage itself to get clear about, what our rights are to the different assets and debts, who's responsible for the different debts, regardless of whose name these different things are in? And so, that is one aspect of it. And I like to go a step further. I think that there are things that we can take from businesses and apply them to our marriages. So, for example, me and my wife, we have what we call the annual shareholders meeting in our household, where we sit down once a year on a minimum. Some people do it quarterly, and kind of lay out, these are the books, the same way that a shareholders meeting in a company would lay out, here's what the finances, of the business look like, or the stock price, here's the assets, here's the debt, here's the balance sheet, the profit and loss. You can do that in your household as well. Here are our assets, here's our debts, here's what the cash flow is looking like. Here's what we have left over every month, or here's what we owe every month. Are you accumulating debt, or are you paying off debt? Are you accumulating assets, or are they shrinking? And having that kind of transparency is good for your relationship. the same way that staying on top of the finances of a business can be good for a business. As a divorce lawyer, I cannot tell you how many times I had couples come into my office and they've been married for 10, 20 years and they don't know what their spouse makes. They don't know what they own. They don't know whether there's a mortgage on the house or not. And, for someone like, for you or me, people that work around finances and kind of, really nerd out and dive into these kinds of things, that's like unfathomable. Like you can't imagine, not knowing like where any of the money is or what your spouse's, financial situation is. But that is actually the norm more than it is the exception for people to not really have a grasp on what the household finances look like. And that leaves people feeling insecure. They don't know where they stand. Are we doing well? Are we not doing well? And financial infidelity can break up just as many marriages as like sexual infidelity does. I mean, it is so important that I don't think that we can like leave it up to chance. And so, yes, if it means that we're going to treat part of our relationship as a business, as much as some people, recoil from that, it's something that we've got to do.
Yeah, because you're actually hitting on one of the second segment here, which is talking about the strategies on like what strategies should people, at least what are your top 3 strategies that you see that people who have successful divorces, and in a sense, I know it's not bad or something like that, but the divorce process obviously is a big moneymaker for a lot of lawyers because they can extend it as long as they need to. Hence, the prenups are like it drops a bucket into when it comes to the price of how expensive a divorce can go through. But to have a nice, successful, clean breakup, say if they didn't have a prenup, what would that look like in the courtroom?
Yeah, probably the biggest things. I mean, when I think about trying to avoid a messy divorce, I am reverse engineering my way out of what are the most common arguments that make things super expensive, super messy, or make the divorce take a really long time. And the number one thing is knowing what the assets and debts are, because you can't divide your marital estate until you know what's in the marital estate. And so, some people think that they're pulling a fast one or they're doing themselves, like a favor by hiding assets from their spouse or kind of keeping, like their own kind of like cushion or secret account here on the side. But what that does is it means that the attorney on the other side is like, okay, we got to send out a subpoena to everybody. We got to go subpoena every bank we think that this person's ever walked into. We got to subpoena their employer. We got to find out where their direct deposit goes. We're going to take a look at their credit report. They're going to demand that be turned over in discovery. And, in many cases, the discovery process takes 6 months. So you're already adding 6 months of time and stress and paying lawyers that charge by the hour to work on your case just for people to figure out what are the assets and debts that are on the table that we're dividing here. And then step 2 is what is part of the marital estate and what is part of your separate property, right? And states have definitions as to how these things are defined. But the general rule is what you came into your marriage with is considered your separate property. And what you accumulate during the course of the marriage is considered your marital property. And your marital property is up for division. Whether it's in your name, whether it's in your spouse's name. A lot of people think that they're keeping their assets separate just because they keep things in separate names, and they should know that the court is not going to honor kind of your informal separation of your finances unless you have it written in an agreement. Court doesn't care if something's in your name. They don't care if it's in your spouse's name. If you accumulated assets in a retirement account in your name during the marriage, that is up for division if you get divorced. And a lot of people have sat them off and say, what do you mean she wants half of my retirement? What do you mean he wants half of the house that I paid the mortgage for the past 10 years? And I have to explain to them that the court doesn't care about what you set up or what your arrangement or whose name is on the title of these assets. Anything that was accumulated during the course of the marriage is considered marital property. And by the way, the assets that you came in with, your separate property, if you contributed anything to those separate assets during the marriage, guess what? You commingled those assets. And so that retirement account that you had 50 grand in on the day that you got married, if you contributed $1 after the date of marriage, that's now commingled. And how do you figure out how much of your retirement account is due to the assets you had in there before the date of the marriage versus how much of your current retirement account is growth that happened from the contributions you made after the date of the marriage. And now we got to bring in forensic accountants and other financial experts to figure out. And you can quickly see how a divorce case that may not be super complicated. You got 150, 250 grand of assets between the two of them. You say this should be simple. We don't have to have much. There's not enough to fight over. Certainly not to spend tens of thousands on lawyers. But very quickly, you can see how all of a sudden there's a ton of things in dispute in an average divorce case. And it doesn't have to be that way if you can sit down with your partner and say, what's mine? What's yours and what's ours? And a lot of people do it very simply. They say, let's agree that anything that's in my name, whether it's an asset or a debt, belongs to me. Mm-hmm. Anything that's in your name, whether it's an asset or a debt, belongs to you. And anything that we choose to put in joint names, we're 50-50 on that. Our house and our joint bank account, we're going to split that 50-50, and everything else we kind of keep separate. But the court's not going to honor that unless you put it into an official legal document.
Man, all right, because my mind is going so many places right now, because I was just thinking about that. I was like, because I actually have a retirement account that I started with a job, one of the first retirement accounts I ever started. And I never transferred it to another bank when I switched jobs and stuff like that. Now that I'm married, I'm trying to move it, and it was like, oh, we need your wife's signature. I was like, but I accumulated this myself. This was way before we even got married. Why I got to bring her into this? And it was like, well, you're married now. I was like, come on. Like, I didn't contribute anything additional, and now I have to deal with this. That makes up so much. Like, that put all the pieces together for me now on why I can't move the money on my own. Sucks.
Yeah. You've entered a financial partnership that touches every penny that you have ever owned or that you will accumulate in the future. It is, the law looks at it like once the day that you were married, mm-hmm. that first paycheck that you earn from the day that you were married is considered marital income. It is no longer your money that you are earning. It is joint money under the law that you're earning. I call this the one paycheck rule. And that means that the first paycheck that you get after the date of the marriage is considered marital property. And everything that paycheck touches now is considered either marital property or it's been commingled if it was separate property. So you take that first paycheck, you put a little bit in your checking, a little bit in your savings, a little bit to pay down your credit card, a little bit on the mortgage of the house you owned prior to marriage, a little bit on your car note, a little bit goes in your retirement. Everything that first paycheck has touched after the date of the marriage is now considered partially separate property and partially marital property. And it's a mess to separate out what's what, if ever necessary down the line, if you don't have a prenup or postnup in place. And so, people say, but I paid for this 100% from a bank account that was in my name only, that was funded with money that I earned. No one ever else touched it. And it doesn't matter because court doesn't care about title, who earned it. It's about whether, it was post the date of your marriage or after the date of your marriage. So it really is a financial partnership in every sense of the word to get married.
Okay, there is a couple stipulations because I want to get into this before we start talking about the features and everything like that. Which is, there's a couple of, I think I've seen one on Sex and the City when I think the name was Charlotte, was going through and saying like, hey, I want to, with her first marriage, she wanted a prenup. And she had these stipulations in that was like up to 10 years, or if something happens within that 10 years, they can invoke it and she'll get a payout for, I think, a couple $1 million per year up until the time that they were married. I think it was a 10-year prenup, but something happened with 5 years in. And so they had to notify and she got paid out that way. Is that something that you can actually put inside a prenup? I've never heard of that before.
Yeah, there are, prenups, the types of provisions that you can put into prenups are virtually unlimited. You can't put anything in there that is like against the law or against public policy, which is a little bit of a fuzzy word, but basically it means like something that the government doesn't want to promote. But certainly there are all types of provisions that people put. I'll give you an example of one that I've talked about previously, which is Michael Jordan's prenup. Michael Jordan has a prenup with his current wife. His first wife, Juanita, he paid her out something along the lines of $150 million in that divorce. And so he is obviously a billionaire today, and he has a prenup with his current wife that says if they get married during the first 10 years of marriage, she gets $1 million per year. If their marriage lasts at least 10 years or longer, then it flips over and she gets $5 million for every year that they've been married. And, people hear this and everybody has some kind of feeling about it. Everybody feels some kind of way about it. Some people are like, oh, that's good. Some people are like, oh, that's horrible. Some people think she's getting too little. Some people think that she's getting too much. But for them, it works because she's going to walk away a millionaire no matter what. Right. If they're married, they've been married, I think 9 years now. She gets going to be a millionaire no matter what. Right. So she is getting, a benefit. She's not going to be left destitute if they break up. But meanwhile, Michael Jordan's worth something like $3 billion now. I'm sure he does not want to have $3 billion up for grabs if he goes into a divorce courtroom and all of his things are getting commingled. He's got business interests and how you value, his stake in an NBA team. I mean, it brings into play all kinds of difficult questions. And for him, he gets the certainty of knowing I'm not putting $3 billion on the line. Like maybe I pay out 50 million, maybe I pay out 100 million if my marriage lasts 20 years, but at least I'm not paying out 1.5 billion, if something goes wrong with my marriage. And for them, it worked. Now, that kind of thing isn't going to work for you or me. Maybe you're worth that. I'm not certainly in that kind of zone. But on a smaller level, certainly we can decide, like what would be fair, if our marriages came to an end, can we at least agree on what would be fair so that we're not fighting about it at a time when we no longer like each other and the communication and trust and respect is at an all-time low in our relationship. So, but yeah, I mean, to answer your original question, you can put anything in terms of like timelines. Some people will use what we call sunset provisions, which is, okay, this prenup is in place for the first 5 years of the relationship, but if we make it past 5 years, then the prenup is nullified and it goes away. And it's just up for nothing. To me, that is the worst possible thing that you could do because, now you're putting back in play, all of the arguments that you could make in court in a divorce. You're taking away all of the clarity that the prenup provides in terms of what falls in my bucket, what's in your bucket, what's in the ours bucket. So I try to discourage anybody from putting, kind of sunset provisions that nullify prenup into their document.
That'll be interesting because a lot of people who, like you said, it depends on when they come into the marriage. Because like starting out with kids, you don't have much to really talk about. So planning a prenup, like say it's somebody who's getting married on their like 20, 25 or something like that. Like they just got their first job or second job at this point, and like they getting married and having a discussion with their parents and so forth. And like, hey, what do you think about a prenup, postnup, getting other people involved? How do you feel about having those boundaries of getting the parents involved inside a grown-up decision, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it is not unusual for parents to be the ones to initiate, the discussions about a prenuptial agreement, particularly if they plan to pass some inheritance down to their kids, right? It is not unusual at all. I have people come to me and they're going to pass down, maybe a family farm or a family business to their child. And the last thing they want is for the family business that they've been working on for 30 years, 60 years, 100 years has been in the family for their child to go through a divorce and all of something that has been in their family, their bloodline is now being divvied up or potentially sold off so that it can be divided in a courtroom years in the future. So I think, the intentions of parents can be good, but ultimately they're going to have to leave that negotiation, on some of the finer points up to their children. A lot of parents will take that tack. They'll say, okay, anything that I'm passing down to you, I want to make sure that stays separate property, that it goes to you, that it goes to your grandchildren and your great grandchildren after that. But whatever the two of you accumulate during your marriage due to your assets, that should be up to to the couple itself, right? You don't want parents coming in and, you can pay for the lawyer, but after that, you probably want it to have some more hands off and make sure that it is the couple. They're the ones that are going to have to be married. And so they should be the ones that are making the decision and determining what their financial relationship is going to look like.
Okay, so as I'm queuing up things that to make sure you have in your prenup or even a postnup, inheritance, dealing with your personal assets, dealing with your together assets, and then I think that should be it. Because when I'm saying you, meaning like both parties, like they should have their own assets. Wow. Okay. And then any other provision as far as if you want to do the 5 year, the 10 year, or 15, whatever you want to have in there, it's growth as a unit. Am I getting it all right?
Yeah, I mean, I would go a few steps further than that.
Oh.
So one other thing that I think that all couples should discuss when it comes to their prenup. A lot of people think that a prenup is, really just outlining what happens if you get divorced. When I really started getting into prenups is, when I got married. It was almost, I'll be celebrating my 8th anniversary in this upcoming April. And, my wife is also a lawyer. And we sat down and we wanted to figure out, like, how can we, number one, obviously avoid the possibility of a messy divorce in the future. But I am a big believer that setting up your finances in the correct way can decrease the chances that you'll get divorced in the first place. And I know a lot of people here, a prenup can actually help my marriage itself. Yes, hang with me here. And so what we said is, one, we're going to have continuing obligations to be transparent about our finances throughout the marriage. So we literally wrote into our prenup this annual meeting that we're going to sit down, we'll disclose all of our finances with each other. That's number one. Number two, when in my divorce work, I saw that a lot of couples argue about each other's spending, right? And so, we attack that in two different ways. One is we put all of our money into the joint bank account, but we each get an allowance that comes into an allowance or an allotment, if you will, that goes into our separate bank accounts that we can spend without any oversight of the other spouse. And that way, the joint bank account is only used for paying what we have agreed ahead of time, our joint expenses, mortgage, utilities, the groceries, our eating out bill, our travel together, those kinds of things, our kids' expenses. And then our separate accounts, we can do whatever we want with it without any oversight. So that's number two. Number three is we agree that anything that we spend from the joint account over $500, we've got to discuss it with each other before we spend it. We wrote that into our agreement. And I've done people who they say anything over $200. We're going to discuss. I had one couple who said anything over $10,000, we have to discuss. Anything under 10 grand, you can swipe the credit card. This was a professional athlete, but anything under 10 grand,
Yeah, I was about to say, like,
without discussion. Again, I don't have it like that,
right.
but, and in reality, my wife and us discuss things that are way under the limit because it has now become routine for us to have these conversations about spending in our household. If I'm spending something from the joint account, that impacts my spouse, whether I like it or not. And some people are like, oh, you got to ask for permission before you spend. No, it's not about permission. It is about mutual respect for each other. And we're going to discuss things that impact each other, whether it's financial or non-financial. It bleeds out into other parts of our relationships because we have built up this habit about discussing things that impact the other person. So those are a few things. Another thing that I saw in my divorce work is that when one spouse wants to go to counseling, marriage counseling, the other spouse isn't interested, and they say, you go to counseling, you need it, I'm not going. And then that spouse says, okay, let's do counseling. And the first spouse is giving up on the marriage. And so my wife and I decided ahead of time that if either one of us wanted to go to counseling, we're doing counseling, no questions asked. And we wrote a provision into our agreement that a lot of my clients like and include in their prenups as well, that says either spouse once a year can trigger this provision, and you got to go to 3 marriage counseling sessions. And you can trigger that once per year. Either spouse can do it. And if either spouse wants to file for divorce or end the relationship, then you got to go to 6 or 8 counseling sessions or 10 counseling sessions, what have you, before you can file for divorce. And that way, you're giving yourself the best opportunity of allowing your marriage to succeed and work on problems before they, blow up into relationship ending disasters. And then we go beyond that. If you go through those 6, 8, 10 counseling sessions and you still don't want to stay married, then you've got to go to mediation, and you've got to try to work out any issues, with alimony, division of assets, custody, child support, anything that you haven't addressed already in your prenup. You got to try to work those out in mediation before you can go to a court. I mean, basically what you want to do is you want to set up a prenup that makes it as unlikely as possible that you'll get divorced in the first place. But if you do, unfortunately, go through divorce, you want it to be as clean, you want it to be as inexpensive, you want it to be as short and as amicable as possible. And the current legal system is not set up to help you do that. But you can do those things in a prenup by kind of putting some of these, roadblocks in place. Sometimes that counseling isn't to save the marriage. Sometimes that counseling takes the form of, how are we going to co-parent our children effectively? How can we divide our assets in a way that doesn't leave each other, financially destitute? Maybe now isn't the best time to sell our marital home, with the market the way that it is, or interest rates the way that they are. Maybe we can come up with an agreement that helps us both financially move on, and keeps more of the money in our pockets and out of the pockets of the divorce lawyers. And I say that as someone who has made money being a divorce lawyer himself. But I certainly don't want to give my money to divorce lawyers, and most of the clients that I work with don't want to do that either.
Man, yeah, because I interviewed a forensic accountant, because I'm glad that you mentioned that, who was saying this, like, sometimes she does get hired, and I've seen a couple court cases where she had to actually present some of the findings and so forth. So, and her price isn't cheap. And I'm looking at the price of your prenup process that you have on your website, and I'm like, this is amazing. I don't want to say the price now because I'm sure it's going to fluctuate throughout the years, as episode is going to live forever. So that's why I'm asking you all the questions now, because I want to make sure that the audience is actually getting everything that they need from this. And so the very last question about the whole prenup and postnup process is, when do you actually invoke the nuptial? And is there a cost associated with it? Or do you just show up to the court and say, like, hey, I want to invoke my divorce?
Yeah. So, in an ideal situation, you are basically filing what I call an uncontested divorce if you have a prenup in place, meaning the prenup has already laid out all the terms of the finances. Now, what a prenup cannot do, a prenup can cover anything that has to do with the division of assets and debts and alimony. A prenup cannot cover anything that has to do with child custody or child support. If you do not have kids, then your prenup is the same thing as your divorce settlement agreement. And a lawyer should be able to take your prenup, turn it into a divorce agreement. You guys sign it, and when you file for divorce, you're filing the settlement agreement at the same time. I call it grand opening, grand closing. You don't ever show up. You usually don't have to show up in court. They file the paperwork. You stamp it. You wait for the judge to give the signature, and you're divorced without ever paying exorbitant lawyers' fees or setting foot in a courtroom. That isn't the ideal situation. Wow. If you have kids, hopefully you're going to mediation. You come up with a parenting plan. You calculate the child support. Same thing. Uncontested divorce. You file it. The filing fees are, a few $100, but it's not anywhere near the tens of thousands of dollars that the average contested divorce case costs. That's what it should look like. If somebody files, typically you're filing, the divorce decree again with a motion to enforce the prenuptial agreement. Hopefully there's no dispute over that. And again, it's very quick. Without a prenup in place, the average contested divorce takes a year. Yeah. In COVID days, with the backups in the court systems that have happened, I've seen the average creep up to more like 18 months. And the average cost of contested divorce right now, as we're recording this, is $15,000 per spouse, right? And so $15,000 per spouse. And it can go way higher than that. And the more money that you earn over the course of the marriage, the more there is in dispute. And all of a sudden, the more it is worth it to pay lawyers to fight over, if you think you can get 60% of the assets, 60% of 1 million is worth a whole lot more than 60% of 50,000, right? And so the better that you do, it doesn't matter what you have going into your marriage. A lot of people are like, oh, I'm not rich when I get married, so I don't need a prenup. Wrong. It doesn't matter what you have when you're getting married. It matters, what causes the cost of a divorce to go up is how much you've accumulated over the course of your marriage, right? So if you're going to make money in the future, that is a better indicator that you need a prenup than how much you have on the date that you get married. And so, I've seen prices of divorces go way, way higher than 30,000. I worked on one case where our client's legal fees alone over the course of a divorce that took more than 4 years, including appeals up to the state Supreme Court, our client paid over $1 million in legal fees on his own. The other side, I'm sure, paid that much. Now, obviously, they were very, very wealthy, but there is almost no limit to how much a divorce can cost when you start talking about, these kinds of numbers. And the more that you make, the more your divorce is going to cost if you don't have a prenup. And so the average, the cost of a prenup is a tiny fraction of the cost of an average divorce. And it's actually a fraction of the cost of the average wedding today. A lot of people spend a lot of money on their weddings. And if you are one of those type of people, then you should probably consider this as just another line item in the cost of getting married. Only, this is going to yield benefits long beyond the wedding day.
And as you mentioned, wedding day, not the marriage, like
not the marriage itself. Right. Which is hopefully lasting decades and not hours.
Yes. Like these celebrities. But we don't need to talk about them today. So the third segment here, which is features, this is about for you personally. Like, what skills or habits that you feel that will take you to that next level?
Yeah. For me, probably the biggest thing is, and this kind of relates back to what we've been, talking about is communication, being transparent about where I am financially. I mean, probably, a lot of people's financial problems, I am no exception, have come when you put your head in the sand, right? The people who are, that bill comes and I don't even want to open it up because I already know I can't pay it. I can't afford it. I don't even want to look at it. I'm not even opening up the bank account. I'm just going to swipe the card and cross my fingers. And so, kind of like being honest with myself about, where I stand, forgiving myself for the mistakes that I've made in the past, recognizing that I am where I am, and using that information to plan for the future. If you're with a partner, getting aligned when it comes to your finances is probably one of the best things you can do for your relationship. I mean, you already know that, money is one of the top things, if not the top thing, that couples argue about. And so if you can eliminate that as an argument, you are improving your relationship right off the bat. And so open lines of communication would be my number one tip.
Nice. Okay. Number one tip, and also for yourself too, right? Like, you got that communication open.
Yeah, I got to communicate to myself.
Is there anything you want to say before we get into the final four questions? I'll leave the audience with.
One thing that I would say is, a lot of people, say, oh, I can never bring up a prenup. I can never bring up, a postnup if you're already married. And, one, I think that there is a way to do it. I think that you can talk about what it is you want to accomplish first. When we talked earlier about not coming out the gate with, the word prenup or postnup with your partner, I think the correct way to do it is to start off with, what do you want to accomplish? Can we agree on some ground rules for our relationship? Can we agree that we should be transparent with each other about what we're coming in with, assets, debts, put it down on paper? Can we agree, how we're, if we're going to have a joint account, what goes in the joint account, what's paid from the joint account, how we're going to fund the joint account, rules on spending for the joint account. Can we agree what's mine, what's yours, what's ours? Do we agree my car's mine, your car's yours? Are we 50-50 on the house we own together? Like these simple conversations, can we agree on those things? And, yes, can we agree on, what would be fair if the relationship came to an end? Not everyone lasts forever. And, it's not going to jinx our relationship just to have, a hypothetical conversation. And so, for the people who are just, they're not going to get a prenup or a postnup, or their spouse is just never going to get on board. The stigma is too much to overcome. I think that it is still very powerful to go through the process. Go through the process of what a couple would do. Have the conversations, even if you never put anything on paper, it's still going to benefit your relationship to disclose your assets and debts to each other, to have these conversations, to have an annual meeting about the state of your household finances. And to have the conversation, be mature and talk about, what would happen if your marriage came to an end.
Now, it's brought up one last question that I think is really important, which is, say if somebody's dating and then they brought up the terminology of prenup before marriage and that person says no, but they really like them. Should they just go ahead on and just cut the relationship immediately and move on?
that's a tough question. I mean, I think that certainly there are things that you can do to try to protect yourself. If your spouse is just absolutely a no on the prenup or postnup, they're a little more difficult. They're not 100%. They're not foolproof. You could still end up in court. But something is better than nothing. You can still have conversations and try to get on the same page. You can get some of the benefit of a prenup by having the conversations, getting on the same page. And I think it's a process. Somebody may not, the first time you bring it up, there may be an absolute no. But as they, as you get on the same page, as you get more aligned on your finances, you get them to listen to this podcast, that we're taping right now. And, people may come around over time and realize, I mean, the public perception of prenups, like the boomer generation, like 3% of them got prenups, and, millennials, Gen Zers are, open to prenups, more along the lines of 40 to 50%. The interest in prenuptial agreements from 2010 to today, so we're just talking about less than 15 years.
Yeah.
The interest in prenups has gone up fivefold, 500% during that time. So the public perception really is shifting. So, would I say break up over, like disagreement over prenup postnup? Maybe not. I mean, I would hang in there. Like I said, these are conversations that should take place over the course of years, not hours. So yeah, that's my opinion.
All right. Thank you for that one. All right. Final 4 questions. You ready?
Let's go.
All right. Number 1, what does wealth mean to you?
Ooh, yeah. To me, wealth means freedom. There's certainly not a dollar amount or, an asset amount. Wealth to me, could be a small number if your needs are low. It could be a large number if your needs and desires are high. But to me, it is freedom to do the things that I want to do, to have my family live the kind of life that we want to live, without fear and anxiety.
Number 2, what was your worst money mistake?
This could be an episode by itself, but luckily it was early in life. I remember being a freshman in college on campus, and these people set up these tables outside the university center, and they were giving away free money. I mean, credit cards. And, I signed up for a few during a time when I had very little income and very little ability to pay them off, and, ran up some credit card debt that turns out they expect you to pay that back eventually, even if it's been years. So, luckily I learned that lesson, in college. So I was able to kind of, correct things in my post-college years, but kind of, not knowing how to use credit will probably be my biggest money mistake.
Right. Number 3, what is your favorite financial or non-financial book?
Yeah. Even the non-financial books that I like still have principles, and things that teach me something about how to deal with my finances. A couple that come to mind are Discipline is Destiny. It's a more recent book by Ryan Holiday, and it's kind of based on Stoic principles. But certainly discipline, is something that can benefit both your life and your finances. And then another favorite of mine would be Essentialism by Greg McKeown. And it is kind of, talking about, eliminating the extraneous things in life so that you can focus on the things that are most important in your life. Certainly, there are parallels to that with your finances, kind of the idea that, you cut expenses in areas that you don't care about so that, you can spend on the things that really are truly important to you. So those are 2 that I'd like to promote.
Yeah, those are 2 new books that I haven't heard on this show yet. So I'll definitely make sure I put those in the show notes. Number 4, what is your favorite dish to make?
Yeah, fun one. Yeah. So I make, I think a pretty mean turkey chili that is, just spicy enough and good. And especially in the colder winter months, really hit the spot. good for you, and not too hard to make.
Nice. Yeah. If you can send me a photo of it, I'll definitely try to make sure it gets to the edited portion of this. If not, I'll make sure it's shared out to the community.
Oh yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. So the very last question of the show, which is, where can people find out more about you?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. So people can find out more about me, about the prenups, watch videos, watch podcasts, download the free ebook. They can do all of that at prenups.com. There's also a link to my book, which is on Amazon, called The Prenup Prescription: Meet the Premarital Contract Designed to Save Your Marriage. Links to all of that is on the website at prenups.com. You can also follow me on social media, Instagram, TikTok. I am Prenup Guy.
Man, that is awesome. The prenup guy. I love that. So thank you so much, Aaron, for coming on the show. We had thank you for actually having this extended show, because this is a tough topic that a lot of people are just afraid of having those conversations. And I think with everything that you laid out, have made life a little easier. And for those people who are just afraid to have those conversations, they can actually start listening to this episode and actually play this back for a loved one and sit down and actually start talking about the things that they want to have in their prenup. And I just want to thank you for all the things that you're doing for not just yourself, but actually sharing your knowledge and your expertise with the community. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
All right, everybody. Y'all be safe. I'm out. Peace.